Yeah, you can begin. Thank you. Rishabh, you are on mute.
Yeah. Hello, yeah.
Yeah.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, fine. I'm starting, right? So, so, thanks for the introduction. Today's lecture is on the role of India and Vietnam in Indo-Pacific supply chains. I'm I'm grateful to the to the audience members who took out time on a weekday to actually uh be part of this lecture due to health reasons. This lecture could not take place last week, and I regret that. Thanks to the thanks to the the organizers for actually rescheduling it and giving me a chance to actually present this. I'll be now going forward with the lecture. All right. So recently, since the COVID-19 pandemic, and even before that, there has been a growing discussion on the importance of supply chains and global value chains, especially the case of bringing supply chains into geopolitical discourse. This became more salient in past the COVID-19 pandemic, when uh, China, owing to its greater control and great and a substantial manufacturing presence, delayed or curtailed supplies to countries who actually required it, in case they actually had a dissenting opinion to uh, China, or spoke something against its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pattern was clearly witnessed in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it clearly brought supply chain resilience and the sufficiency of nations to actually deal with this. This actually acquired relevance in the Biden Biden administration, as it was sworn in 2021, where it had to ultimately find a strategy where they could actually not essentially decouple completely, but to de-risk supply chains and make them safer and more reliable. The approach they took to it was actually friendshoring, essentially. Now let me just get back to how things took shape. All right. So in this case, we are first looking to understand the role of Vietnam in the global value chains. So Vietnam as a country, its its economy is heavily reliant on foreign direct investment and trade, essentially. At present, it holds a economic trade surplus of $123.5 billion with the US as of this year. So it's clearly a country which puts a heavy emphasis on trade and manufacturing to essentially he have its economic growth and its economic sustenance. So to look at how Vietnam is embedded in the Indo-Pacific framework and the RCEP. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was a initiative taken by the Biden administration in 2022, where it had actually aimed to create a regional trading bloc which could be a sort of a alternative to the ch- ch- Chinese BRICS and RCEP. So for a alternative, they had actually chosen that. Vietnam had joined the talks in May 2022, which signaled a clear ambition to be a part of the trade network and be a rule maker uh, economically with regards to tariffs and the market access at that point. Vietnam had framed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as a open, inclusive, transparent, consistent with WTO norms, and supportive of Vashian centrality, which would be a supplement to the existing FTAs, is rather than a complete shift. With respect to the four pillars, Vietnam has engaged with the four pillars of the Indo Pacific Economic Framework in a coherent and systematic way. With regards to trade, focusing on digital trade, labor, environment, and regulatory practices, Vietnam has seen this as a way to actually align its practices with the US and the advanced economy standards, which would improve its market economy status case and deepen its role in regional economic architecture. Vietnam also has been a part of the supply chain pillar in the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Now, let's just to understand the a supply chain, one has to look at the China plus one framework. The China plus one framework essentially originated during the first Trump administration, when the US China trade war and tariffs on China actually it made it essential for countries to actually de-risk their manufacturing in China and shift it to countries which are actually which are actually closer to it and can source the materials while essentially complying with the US policies on tariffs and the ongoing trade war which was taking place. Vietnam is a central part of the China plus one strategy. Firms have used it to hedge against China related geopolitical and tariff risks, but they have continued to rely on Chinese inputs and the regional supply chains. The first Trump administration catalyzed this shift via its tariffs on China, which were part of the US China trade war at that time. The Biden administration actually consolidated it, it streamlined it, and synergized it in a way of a de-risking approach, and also took the route of actually friend-shoring supply chains, which was essentially that the US would rely on friendly countries to essentially de-risk its supply chains rather than completely decoupling from China. Okay, so one thing to understand here is, even as we look at Vietnam as part of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, why is it a key structural player in the China plus one strategy, which helps it to become a a vital um, a vital cog in the Indo-Pacific supply chain, and a viable, if not actually alternative, one which is actually supplementing China. Okay, so let's look at the factors in a clear way. It offers low labor costs, geographic proximity to southern China, participation in a dense network of FTAs, CPTPP, RCEP, EU, Vietnam FTA. It is these actually make it a natural plus one side, because this is a country which is very, very, very enmeshed in global supply chain, and a key country which is actually not protectionist, and is trying to be a part of the global multilateral trading system, and has a export oriented economy. Many global firms now focus on China for the Chinese or Asian market, Vietnam for the EU or US market. The production is split in the case of electronics, garments, furniture, and footwear in particular. Vietnamese manufacturing, however, it needs to be understood, is deeply embedded in Chinese supply chains, with recent years seeing around one third of its imports coming from China. China and Chinese investors clearly account for a large share of the new projects. Vietnam often also is a reassembly site, focusing on the reassembly part. Vietnam essentially, like, if a value chain is created, the raw materials are sourced from one place. It is actually manufactured in one place. The automation processes and everything take place in a different country. However, the ultimately the the actually assembling of the parts and the finishing takes place in Vietnam, and then it is shipped off to its required destination as per how the trade takes place. Chinese inputs essentially get finished in Vietnam and then shipped off with a Vietnamese origin label. Now, the Vietnamese origin label actually can make one think that, okay, this was made in Vietnam. But essentially, a large part of the thing is happening in China, but it is ultimately getting finished off in Vietnam, the product getting finished off in Vietnam, and then it is seeming like this has been like some sort of a alternative has been created. But one needs to take a critical look at this as whether this is so. Now, the first Trump administration, in the 2018-19 US-China trade war, put unilateral tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, which was a key external shock which pushed multinationals into the China plus one diversification framework. Vietnam emerged as a key winner, absorbing the production in electronics, textiles, furniture, and consumer goods, which targeted the US market. Studies and research have described it as the greatest winner of the US-China trade war in terms of export and growth. By the end of President Trump's first term, many global companies had adopted China plus one or two or three strategies, and Vietnam was one of the top destinations where the manufacturing or the assembling had actually shifted. This led to a very high economic and GDP growth rate for Vietnam among the ASEAN countries. The bilateral trade also between the US and Vietnam expanded rapidly by the early 2020s. Goods trade exceeded 100 billion USD. This trade was dominated by Vietnamese exports of electronics, textiles, footwear, furniture, and imports of machinery and inputs from the US. Basically, it's almost, if one were to look at the historical pattern, Vietnam is like trying to do a bit of what China was doing in the 1980s. Since it essentially tried to develop itself as a manufacturing hub to the world, gradually making products, shipping it. The reason, actually, one thing this was also feasible for these countries is because this it was actually highlighted. Vietnam has a proper geographic location, it is integrated in supply chains, but it is also low labor costs and a skilled population with a proper FDI policy and proper framework which can actually allow these things to take place. The surge of exports to the US creates a large US trade deficit with Washington. And the thing is, suddenly the trade deficit thing has become a trade deficit has suddenly become a very villainized term, actually. Like, the trade deficits are being weaponized in present discourse. Now let's understand one thing. Trade deficits, no one intends it to actually occur as such. It just simply means one thing, that this country buys more from this country than what it sells to that country, actually. Now this happens according to comparative advantage and the needs of each country, and the way the economy of a country is structured. Various countries are large exporters, various countries import a lot. However, the way trade deficits are seen as some sort of a scam which has taken place in the multilateral global trading system needs to be recognized is a flawed practice, as a economy as large and critical as the United States has a larger consumption capacity and higher GDP, more per capita income. So of course, the people of a population like the US would be more consuming, actually. And we can't expect countries like Vietnam, Singapore, Switzerland, or a country in Europe, which are export oriented economy and have their own exports, to suddenly have the same amount of imports from the US, because exports and imports are dependent on the resource utility and the uh, policies of each country. So the trade deficit thing created alarm in Washington, and Washington pressed Vietnam to clamp down on trade fraud. Because let's look at this, which I this point I had earlier put out in the part where China was still very much involved in the supply chain. Vietnam was essentially like being a final conduit point for Chinese goods made in China, and then just being passed off to the rest of the world, shipped off. So this was essentially a problem of transshipment. Washington had pressed Vietnam to clamp down on trade fraud and transshipment. Chinese goods relabeled and re exported as Vietnamese, which was enabling China to essentially avoid the tariffs. Let's look at this in this way. Supposedly, there is a situation between two friends, or two partners. Okay, let's assume this partner says that he won't take take resources from his factory. Supposedly now the factory owner supplies to another factory, and then that factory sells of the same supply to the person who had initially refused to take supplies from that factory. So in a way, Chinese goods are still being exported, but only because the source of export has been the the source of export has been changed. The tariffs do not apply. So this is actually a cause of concern for Washington. Let's look at the response which Vietnam has taken. Vietnam has pursued bamboo diplomacy, where it has leaned into new foreign direct investment and trade with the US, while also being very careful to avoid being seen as anti China. Let's understand that Vietnam's economy is actually dependent on Chinese investment, as well as China is also a market for Vietnamese goods. Vietnam has also accelerated structural reforms via FTAs, which has strengthened its role as a global manufacturing hub. It has tried to deepen and position its attractiveness as this global manufacturing hub. Means it's not only a case of US China rivalry or a trade war. Vietnam aims to position itself as a country which will make stuff and sell stuff. Let's simplify this. Vietnam has continued to treat China as its largest trading partner, an essential source of capital and inputs. Its China plus one rule also is owing to a large fact because it has good ties with China and economic interdependence with Beijing. Now let's look at the Biden administration from 2021 to 2025, where the hedging approach by Vietnam was also continued. And like the Trump administration in the first term tried to decouple from China in ways. But President Biden was focused more on de risking and friendshoring. The strategic competition with China was continued and framed in in terms of a competition. However, whether the adversarial tone of the first Trump administration was actually toned down a little, as both focused on competition but not a rivalry per se. But both countries, US and China at that time, also looked at areas where they could cooperate and dialogue could be maintained between the leaders of the top two economies in the world. The Trump era tariffs state this one needs to look at properly that President Biden continued with the Trump era policy on tariffs on China. This essentially is a continuity of the China strategy which was pursued by the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. Now, the elevation of US Vietnam ties which took place in the Biden administration. The US and Vietnam in 2023 had upgraded their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership explicitly which linked economic cooperation, technology, and supply chain security. Vietnam was termed a vital partner for secure, resilient supply chains and measures for encouraging US private investment and supporting critical sectors like semiconductors, clean energy, deepening defense and educational cooperation. Vietnam was also termed as a connector economy, which bridges US and China supply chains. Because essentially it was serving as a sort of a conduit for Chinese goods, relabeled, repackaged, assembled, and shipped off. It was termed as a place where US aligned French shoring and Chinese dual circulation both take place. US and firms of other countries, like supposedly, let's take Japan or certain European countries, they expanded manufacturing in Vietnam, which which was a move taken to reduce over reliance on China, as these countries had learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. You cannot essentially depend on a country which has become adversarial and competition for your supply of goods and essentials and resources. You have to de-risk. But one thing also has to be seen, that China has not seen Vietnam as adversarial in this context. Chinese firms have increased investment in Vietnam, retained access to the US market and global markets, and also dealt with the tariffs. The importance of Vietnam to China was clearly witnessed, as months after the elevation of ties with the US to a comprehensive strategic partnership was seen by was seen by a visit by President Xi Jinping to Vietnam, where a shared future partnership and a CSP upgrade, which underlined that Vietnam's China plus one role sits inside the US China competition to anchor the supply chains there. Now, in context of this, to understand properly, if a theoretical lens is taken to this to understand Vietnam's approach in the supply chains, it is a case of hedging where active neutrality, simultaneous cooperation, and soft balancing with both the powers is pursued, along with the diversification of partnerships where Vietnam its preserves autonomy in a polarizing region, which is at a risk of fragmentation, having to pick sides, as the US and China, the two largest economies in the world, grow increasingly hostile. It has played sort of a in between game where it has avoided a formal alliance with Washington, or taken overtly or not taken overtly anti-China positions, while increasingly welcoming US support in the South China Sea and trying economic diversification. Vietnam used the Indo-Pacific focus of the Trump administration and its concern about China to expand cooperation, but kept it in terms of comprehensive partnership and issue-based cooperation, not alliance politics. Alliance politics would essentially take it to actually being putting itself in the US camp, essentially, which Vietnam, country which is very close, which is a neighbor of China, did not want to be seen as doing. Vietnam also accepted growing US security assistance, which was for foreign military financing maritime security, US $104 million from 2017 to 2023, with a major jump from 2018, but it stayed below the threshold of a formal alliance, continuing to buy Russian systems. I think this pattern has been seen in actually India also, where we buy goods from the US, elevate defense ties, but we also do not completely put all defense in the US basket. And we also have ties with Russia. We try to keep ties with China. So yeah, it's just a good coherent hedging strategy. Vietnam has also continued to maintain high level to party engagement using the comrades plus brothers rhetoric, along with economic interdependence. There have been coercive episodes with, with China applying pressure on Vietnam over drilling in disputed waters. However, this was followed by reconciliation and agreement to handle maritime issues and work on a South China Sea Code of Conduct. They avoided a public confrontation essentially after President Trump in 2017 wanted to mediate between them. Like, this is also a sort of a bilateral dealing occurring between these two countries, which do not want the US to mediate this. Vietnam has not, despite being a partner of the US, it has not gone around endorsing everything the US does. It has repeatedly affirmed its four no's: no military alliances, not siding with one country against another, no foreign bases, and no use of force or threat of force in international relations. It has left the room for case by case cooperation. Vietnam also has not completely relied on either the US and China. It has aimed to broaden ties with Japan, India, Australia, EU, ASEAN mechanisms, using inclusive diversification as a key operational feature of its hedging strategy. Now, with regards to supply chain relocation, research shows many multinational firms have moved labor-intensive production lines from China to Vietnam after 2018 to preserve profit margins and reduce exposure to US tariffs. An empirical study also showed multinationals tied to the extensive margin of Vietnam's export growth from 2017 to 2020 started exporting new HS level products to the US that previously came from China. Vietnam's advantages in these regions in this period have already been put in the prior discussion. The analysis of US import data suggests a non-trivial share of Vietnam's exports to the US in the early 2020s, which have been flagged as potential rerouting, which describes how closely the export-oriented boom of Vietnam was tied to reconfigured China-linked value chains rather than pure relocation. The policy stance of Vietnam involved quietly tightening rules of actually origin enforcement and engaging US authorities to show cooperation while still welcoming Chinese investment, because the US had concerns that Chinese goods were being transferred from Vietnam. So Vietnam aimed to engage the concerns of the US. Vietnam has positioned itself as a bridge, a low-cost assembly country, and as a finishing platform between Chinese manufacturing hubs and US and American US and European consumer demands, gaining access to their markets and not also risking its ties with its powerful neighbor. Exports to the US have actually jumped in the case of Vietnam, as the data shows, from $47.6 billion in 2018 to $61.4 billion in 2019, a 35.6 increase. In 2020, there were roughly 77.1 billion. Vietnam's export growth is strongly associated with sectors where China previously used to export a lot to the US, and there was also rising multinational cooperation activity in Vietnam, which indicates MNC-driven reallocation rather than a purely increased domestic capacity. Vietnam, as put out by a scholar, Vietnam didn't just sell more of everything to the US, it expanded most of where it could step in, where China's previous niches using Chinese inputs and foreign investors which were operating in Vietnam in order to de-risk from US tariffs. This has seen a boom in four sectors. Let's look at it. Electronic and electrical goods, computers, phones, electronic components, and related machinery. This was heavily tied to Samsung, Intel, LG, among other investors, which used Vietnam as an assembly base for global supply chains. Textiles, garments, and footwear. It was the existing strength of Vietnam in low-cost garment production due to having the supply capacity, the factories, and low-cost labor. It was garments and furniture, wood products were also the fastest growing imports of Vietnam from 2018 onwards. Vietnam also exported more light machinery and parts to the US for 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 assembly and as a finishing point for regional value chains. Existing product lines to the US expanded in volume and value. New HS level products began to be exported to the US from Vietnam as the MNCs had relocated production. So now let's look at the new layer which has occurred in terms of the US Vietnam relationship since 2023. The comprehensive strategic partnership, as described prior, it has a new layer of high tech and the joint plans to build up Vietnam's role in semiconductor assembly, testing, packaging, and supporting workforce. Well, one would ask that why suddenly one would think that why is the US actually trying to build semiconductors and those things in Vietnam? I think this needs to be looked at the case of required need for semiconductors and the need to actually completely depend on Taiwan, which is a major source of semiconductors. Vietnam is a sort of a diversification partner in this regard, not completely being an alternative, but it can act as sort of a safe bet in this regard. This helps in shifting supply chain dynamics from pure cost arbitrage to capability building. US policy is focused on training Vietnam's local population and not just making it a assembly site for Chinese or multinational parts. Many Vietnamese exports to the US still embed Chinese parts. There is continued scrutiny, even in 2023, of growing Chinese exports in via Vietnam, especially in electronic, steel, and other tariff sensitive goods. The US pressure on rules of origin and traceability is expected to increase as firms use Vietnam as a China plus one base. Must A focus must be on sourcing more local or non-Chinese sources in order to avoid future tariffs or restrictions, as the transshipment has continued to be an irritant in US Vietnam ties, even under the Biden administration. One needs to look at the balancing act which Vietnam is playing here, trying to remain attractive to Chinese investors, accommodating US demands for cheap, clean, and transparent supply chains, which look more like re-export platforms. If one looks at a detailed analysis of the Biden administration's approach to Vietnam in this regard, they involve three things: the 2023 US Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, the semiconductor specific initiatives, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, supply chain agreement. The CHIPS Act was a key source of the semiconductor supply chains in Vietnam. A MOU was signed which formalized a bilateral partnership where Vietnam would help build a more diverse, reliable global semiconductor chain for the US industry. There was a commitment to use the CHIPS Act, $500 million over 5 years to support Vietnam. This was to be done by assessing and upgrading Vietnam's semiconductor ecosystem, regulatory framework, identifying workforce and infrastructure needs, supporting investment conditions for assembly, testing, and packaging, along with related activities. Now, getting back to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The supply chains initiative, which Vietnam was a part of, used IPEF's supply chain pillar, resilience, logistics, skilled workforce, along with local supply development, to consolidate its position at a core manufacturing and re-export hub. Vietnam also made a commitment to enhance supply chain transparency and information sharing to spot bottlenecks and disruptions consistent with its domestic laws. Encouragement of diversification via multiple suppliers to reduce overconcentration and vulnerability, including joint efforts to spread production. Agreement to undertake cooperative activities to increase resilience, efficiency, sustainability, and security of IPF supply chains. The IPF agreement, though not broad, clearly laid out policies which would help Vietnam be a key player in supply chains. Vietnam was also part of the clean economy, being a part of the clean energy and climate cooperation. Vietnam has a net zero 2050 pledge and has a need for green finance, technology, and standards to support energy transition. The IPF gives Vietnam leverage, embedding it more tightly into US-centric and Japan-supported supply chains, reinforcing the 2023 US-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. It is also positioning Vietnam not merely as a place of low-cost assembly, but also making it useful for higher value activities. Vietnam is also involved in the RCEP, and it is a core platform of its trade policy. So I think I'm done with the first Trump administration, Biden administration. Now I think let's just take a brief look at the second Trump administration. The second Trump administration, which was inaugurated in 2025, has institutionalized an America First trade policy. It was built on over-the-board tariffs, country-specific reciprocal tariffs. Tariff instruments such as Section 232 national security tariffs were used to impose tariffs on countries along with new reciprocal tariffs, which was pointed as a result of bilateral imbalances and perceived unfairness. Well, in President Trump's words, they are ripping us off. The key elements relevant to Vietnam included a global minimum base tariff of 10% and higher reciprocal rates, which was as a result of large US trade surpluses. Well, the AIPA judgment of the recent Supreme Court of the US Supreme Court has invalidated that, but the recent development is that President Trump has imposed a 15% minimum base tariff and wants countries to actually stick by the previous deals which had been negotiated in 2025 and even in 2026 as the Trump administration continues to negotiate on trade. Now, tariffs as high as more than 40% were imposed, and I think Vietnam got a rate of 46%, which was essentially crippling to its exports to the US. The tariffs were meant as a deterrent to transshipment through third countries, especially those acting as a conduit for Chinese goods. The administration framed these threats as economic rebalancing and a tool to reshape supply chains away from China. However, this was clearly um, bit of a yeah. Sorry for the sorry for the window interruption. This was clearly a big shock to a country like Vietnam, which was supposed to be a US partner and had also become and had also got into a comprehensive strategic partnership. However, unpredictability remains a prominent feature of US trade policy in President Trump's second administration. Now, Washington would maintain a 20% reciprocal tariff on most imports from Vietnam after an agreement reached in September 2025, as the US factory described it as reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. Vietnam would remove tariffs on almost all US goods and grant preferential access for food, agriculture, and certain manufactured goods, along with large engine automobiles. Now, one thing one needs to understand is everything made in America can't be sourced out to everywhere in the world. The type of automobile market which exists in America caters to the demands of the American market. A country like Vietnam or supposedly certain countries in Southeast Asia won't have the market for it. So, just in my opinion, in this case, despite even if the market access is given, that company still has to sell in that country and the buying has to be done by the consumer. So unless the demand for those particular goods exist in that countries, even those strong handing countries into removing all market barriers and giving preferential access won't ultimately yield what President Trump wants here, which is very minimal trade deficits, huge markets for US goods everywhere. The arrangement codified structurally high barriers for most Vietnamese exports, but carve-outs and incentives for select sectors, tightening enforcement against transshipment. Now, many countries were actually shocked that even certain countries which the US had very minimal trade with also get high rate of tariffs. The US part of the Trump administration, Howard Lutnick put this as dealing with the transshipment threat of Chinese goods, where other countries were essentially being used as facilities to ship Chinese goods. Yet, despite these impediments, US Vietnam trade has continued to grow from $119.6 billion to $153.2 billion in 2025, increase of another 28%, and the surplus as of currently reaching $134 billion. This does show patterns that there have been sectoral effects on Vietnamese exports as a result of the 20% existing tariff, despite the arrangement reached in September 2025. Electronics and ICT. Vietnam's rapid growth in terms of shipping electronic goods and acting as an exporter of that has been affected. Companies had leverage, but there was a heavy dependence on Chinese components. Tariff and transshipment rules incentivized more localization, sourcing diversification in ASEAN and beyond. Furniture and consumer goods have also been affected by this. Vietnam made concessions to the US with regards to its trade policy. It agreed to remove tariffs on all US goods, preferential access for agriculture, American automobiles, and other American products, and buying more Boeing aircraft, giving orders from Vietnam Airlines, the cooperation with the US agencies to cooperate on trade. Okay. Now, I think this has been a detailed enough discussion on Vietnam. Let's now go back to India for a brief understanding of the role which India has played with regards to supply chains and trade strategies in the from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. I think we would have to cut it a little short because we don't have that much time to actually focus on the present dynamics in the Trump administration. Okay, let's go. In the first Trump administration, India endorsed the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and it positioned itself as a key partner of the US. And the US also considered it as a cornerstone partner based on the 2017 National Security Strategy. The 2017 National Security Strategy also framed China in adversarial terms. India got the designation of a major defense partner, which enabled high-end military technology transfers. Okay. Now, trade deficits with India were also a concern for the US administration. This concern was for President Donald Trump, and it led to the termination of India's GSP preferential trade status, which increased the US energy imports, and India was asked to diversify from Iranian oil as the US had imposed sanctions. This actually also affected the Indian investment in the Chabahar port. So it was clearly a thing which was detrimental to India. In India also, in response, slapped tariffs on 28 US products in response to US duties on steel, aluminum. New Delhi had drafted the retaliatory tariffs earlier, but held off on implementing them as talks were still ongoing, hoping to somehow avoid this preferential trade status, the removal of the preferential trade status. The Quad was also elevated to a cabinet level ministerial meetings. Of course, the Trump administration had revived the Quad in 2017. The Quad as an organization. The Quad also aimed to address supply chain diversification. The America First approach actually continued to create trade friction, as we see with the imposition of tariffs and the recent term, I think, which President Trump used in 2025 was calling India the Maharaja of tariffs. And even in 20, he was constantly complaining about India imposing tariffs on Harley Davidson motorcycles, American products, and calling it a very high tariff nation. So now looking at the Biden administration here. But before we go there, let's just understand what India did during the US-China trade war. There were tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods and retaliatory measures, which were triggering a broader decoupling between the two countries, US and China at that time. This was making firms reconsider their overdependence on Chinese-centric supply chains. India had to also face the damage with US tariffs on steel and aluminum as stated. However, India's exports to the US grew in sectors like IT services, pharmaceuticals, engineering goods, chemicals, textiles, which partially substituted some Chinese products which were earlier going to the US market. Policymakers and industry in India framed this as a once in a generation opportunity for India to scale up manufacturing. However, not much of concrete initiatives were taken. Some manufacturing did move to India, but it did not or have that much of it as to have a clear edge over countries like Vietnam or other Southeast Asian economies. There was, if we understand this as to why this took place, there was clear infrastructure gap with regards to manufacturing, not a clear coherent policy outlined by the government. Just laying out of incentives won't get the country to a good place in these things. India, though, also later tried to de-risk its supply chains. It formed the Resilience Supply Chain Initiative, launched in September 2021 by India, Japan, and Australia in response to growing alarm on and over dependence on China in global supply chain. See, this is occurring against the backdrop of COVID-19, where and also India's skirmish with China at Galwan, where the death of 20 soldiers created anti-China sentiment in the country. RSCI here was created to meet a goal set by the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue to improve the security of global supply chains, including the US-China trade confrontation, disruptions caused by COVID-19, increasing geopolitical competitions. For many and for various sectors, India looked like a logical place to invest. India has the advantage of being a largest provider of software solutions. Its pharmaceutical sector is the third largest. Ranks first in production of generic medicines and vaccines. However, one thing which needs to be kept in mind here is that India has, to a large extent, dependence on China in sourcing raw materials for this. So, now, the strategic signaling of India in the trade war, there was an emphasis on self-reliance, economic integration, but Atmanirbhar Bharat was a term used here. It was not framed as autarky, which was a term. Means basically state state supported industrialization, which was a term of the Nehruvian era, where the state was supposed to be the key instrument of economic development. India India in the COVID-19 time had selectively tightened FDI rules from neighboring countries and had enhanced scrutiny of Chinese investments, which signaled an uh, alignment with Western positions, which had also grown wary of China. India did not want China in key sectors, actually, high security sectors, like supposedly 5G rollout and things like that. So India was aiming to security. So by this time, India has essentially securitized China. It is a clear threat, and but also in terms of economy, supply chains. And India is a major trading partner of China. China has a trade deficit here. We import more from China than China essentially buys from us. But overnight, this could not be managed. So India's strategy here was essentially to let trade continue with China, but also develop alternatives which can avoid complete over reliance and exploitation by China. India was trying to essentially maximize leverage between competing blocks, like the block by China here. India did not join RCEP, actually, which was seen as disappointing because various advocates expected India to actually join the bloc and participate in regional trade. However, India, owing to its domestic policy concerns and the worries that removing tariffs would ultimately lead to cheap Chinese goods flooding Indian markets and further affecting Indian manufacturing. So India did not join the RCEP. The policy debates in India were focused on using the US-China trade war as accelerating a China plus one reordering. India was looked at to be the feasible democratic alternative to China, which would be reliable and also enhance the Indo-Pacific manufacturing outlook. Now, India was a trusted partner in the Biden administration's friend-shoring strategy for critical Indo-Pacific supply chains focused on semiconductors, critical minerals, and clean energy technologies. The shift from pure efficiency to security plus resilience in supply chains created a space for India to present itself as a democratic large-scale alternative to China, And this framing was continued in the Biden administration. This was not seen as a dependency on the US, but as strategic autonomy. Now, just a critical exploration here. Strategic autonomy, some people see it as confusion. It is also framed as multi alignment, where India is supposed to engage with multiple partners on its own terms in order to enhance national interest. However, in many cases, actually, strategic autonomy as a term, it can also be loosely used for interest based ties, actually, where a country does not have fixed allies or friends. It 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 i it chooses to actually align with whichever bloc based on its interests at that time. So in my understanding, strategic autonomy is a sort of a confusing buzzword which is used whenever India has to align itself with some country, but does not have a coherent position with regard to that. Okay, just a personal point put forward here. The organizing principle of the Biden administration was friendshoring, relocate or expand key value chains into India, and tighten scrutiny of Chinese inputs in sensitive areas like 5G, telecom, and electronics. The ISET initiative, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, was the main bilateral framework to hardwire technology and supply chain cooperation. This was an initiative taken. This was an initiative taken by the two governments to create mechanisms to review policy, regulatory, and infrastructure barriers to relocate semiconductor manufacturing, quantum technology, and packaging to India, and as a way to also recommend fixing and to enhance supply chain security, as semiconductors, chips were a key concern of the Biden administration. India had benefited from the efforts by the US to friendshore. However, India's ability to align and leverage with US policy direction would be determined by more than US intentions. It would depend on creating clear financial incentives and proper infrastructure, which would help companies relocate and develop supply chains in India and to draw financial investment. The Trump administration, however, took a shift on the ISET initiative and had a different approach to domestic technology policy. I'm referring here strictly to the second Trump administration. Its approach has been marked by a close convergence with Silicon Valley, and it has tried to deregulate to support innovation. However, there have been backlash from the domestic US space, which we call the Haga base, which have been vocally supportive of industrial policy, which have been vocally supportive of industrial policy and reshoring supply chains. The Trump administration also launched the Pax Silica initiative on 11 December 2025. India recently, in February, got an invitation, as the US ambassador said that India would be involved in it. India's initial exclusion actually surprised many, as India has had in the Biden administration been seen as a key partner of the US on the issue of technology cooperation, semiconductors, and basically as a key partner on emerging technologies, AI, technology development, and everything. And there were also there was also in a US visit undertaken by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the US. There was talks of technology transfer and greater cooperation, and uh, basically the Make in India thing was also discussed, that US companies would consider like General Electric and all those would consider technology transfer. However, there was not much put out after the visit. So there was some incoherence with regard to that. India, on its part, pursued a dual-track domestic incentives (PLI) schemes, chip fab subsidies, design support, plus the partnership with the US to attract top-tier firms and ecosystem players. As mentioned, India benefited from the Biden administration's friendshoring policy in joint ventures, along with technology partnerships at mature nodes, along with advanced packaging facilities which were developed in India. There was aim to build a full stack in India, design centers, fabrication, assembly, testing, packaging, OSAT, and talent development programs integrated into global supply chains. There was a clear pressure from Washington to exclude China from high risk sectors like 5G, and for India to have more control of its digital supply chains to ensure broader technological cooperation. India joined the IPEF. India joined Pillar 2, which was the supply chains of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It stayed out of the traditional trade pillar, which signaled targeted engagement where resilience, not tariffs, is central. The IPF agreement committed in India to cooperate on identifying critical sectors, monitoring risks, and coordinating responses to disruptions. A supply chain council was created with the US as chair and India as vice chair, giving India a leadership seat in setting Indo-Pacific supply chain priorities and standards. India's role here included mapping vulnerabilities, sharing best practices on risk management, and working emergency response tools on information sharing, alternative sourcing arrangements for key products. Both governments, in the pillar of clean energy, worked on adopting the roadmap for US India initiative and to build a safe and secure global energy supply chain, which put India as a key US partner in this policy. The United States and India worked to unlock $1 billion in new multilateral financing via the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which included catalyzing India's domestic clean energy supply chain build-out. India's PLI schemes also invested over $4.5 billion to catalyze nascent clean energy manufacturing. So, in conclusion, it can be clearly seen that there have been focus on supply chains in both the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, and even I think the shift has shifted a bit more to oh, tariffs and deficit reduction in the second Trump administration. However, supply chains will continue to remain relevant in emerging geopolitics as countries essentially try to take control and ensure their security and sustainability in terms of the growing risks and geopolitical polarization. I think I would conclude at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishabh, for the lecture. I hope it was very much a detailed understanding of the Indo-China trade route specific and what are the future expectations that we are going to see. And I believe it was very much enriching for me. I would like to cover up with some questions that I have that how would you expect India's market entry strategy in ASEAN countries under its active policy? Like whether it be more beneficial or will it be like remain the same that as it is continuing to be, or like how the Atmanirbhar Bharat or Make in India would make a easier change for this rift. This is my question. You are still on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I have unmuted myself. Yeah. So based on what your question was, that how would India's cooperation with ASEAN countries would 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 work in the area of trade, right? This was the question, right?
Exactly.
How it
And with the
Yeah,
coming in
yeah. Okay.
Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, how would this be
Yeah, yeah.
make it a change?
See, Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, they continue, but Indian companies, they actually invest in in uh, in those countries. Like India has also invested in Vietnam in certain sectors. Indian companies would actually play a key role in this, as to they can like build in those countries and also manufacture in those countries. Essentially, like if India can actually strengthen supply chain collaboration with ASEAN countries with regards to this, I think it would also in a way serve to slightly de-risk itself from China, because we still have a trade deficit with China, which will, and the dependence on China would continue to remain unless we find more feasible alternatives. But Atmanirbhar Bharat completely does not mean that we are completely focusing everything on domestic self-sufficiency, because in a interconnected world, that sort of domestic sufficiency is not a feasible strategy. It would clearly like make it would need a lot of investment, and would create actually economic burden rather than focusing on actually efficiency and ways in which this can be achieved at a minimal cost. That's my view on this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think we are done with this thing. Thank you, Kurisha, for giving such an insightful lecture on this topic of this one of the most important arenas of the 21st century of the contemporary world politics. So good night, everyone, and thanks for joining the lecture. Thank you.